Hello guys, Dr. Spooks here. If you enjoy my videos, please click the like button. It's the only way YouTube's algorithm really notices me. I would be very grateful to you. I'm not afraid of the dark. That's what I shouted at my older brother as I slammed my car door shut. Things have changed since then. I've changed. I remember the worry in his eyes, how he handed me my backpack, the way he rattled off an endless list of things I should be afraid of, bears and mountain lions and getting lost, oh my. He presented each one as reason after reason why this idea was foolish, saying I still had time to back out, to save face. I remember rolling my eyes, snatching my backpack from his grip, tossing it into the back seat and yelling that I'm not afraid of the dark before speeding away towards the looming silhouette of the Sierra Nevada mountains. They stood out stark against the setting sun like jagged teeth, ready to devour the sky. How I wish I had listened. I was wrong. He was right. I'm terrified of the dark now. Let me rewind a bit. It all started about a week ago. I was struggling with severe anxiety and depression, could barely leave my apartment, constantly worried about every little thing that could go wrong, just feeling numb, and enough was enough. My therapist, Dr. Amelia Chen, had suggested that I try solo hiking. She said it might clear my mind, that the wilderness, the silence, the solitude would do me good. Sometimes, Lily, she said, leaning forward in her chair, her kind eyes meeting mine, we need to face our fears to overcome them. Nature has a way of putting things into perspective. I nodded, not really believing her, but willing to try anything at this point. She gave me a list of trails, some more challenging than others. I decided on the most difficult one, which was about a 5-hour hike from the last marked campsite deep in the Sierra National Forest. When I told my brother Mike about my plans, his reaction was a mix of surprise and concern. "Are you sure about this, Lil?" His voice cracked a little. I nodded, saying nothing. He ran a hand through his hair, a habit he's had since we were kids. "I mean, it's a pretty intense trail, especially for someone who hasn't hiked in years." He paused, then shrugged. "But then again, the views are breathtaking. It'll definitely give you some perspective, and the stargazing out there is incredible." I thanked him and turned to leave, but he called out again. "Hey, Lily," I turned back. "Don't let the wilderness spook you, okay? And remember what Dad always said, stick to the trail no matter what you hear. You might encounter something you're not prepared for." The drive up to the Sierra was surprisingly calming. The winding roads that snaked their way through the valleys and up the mountainsides were exhilarating to navigate, and soon my mind settled into a peaceful state. I found myself humming along to the radio, something I hadn't done in months. I had decided to disconnect completely for this trip, even going as far as leaving my phone in a locker at the visitor center. I wanted to be entirely free of all digital distractions, able to focus on the present rather than worry about the past or stress about the future. The park ranger gave me an odd look when I handed over my phone, but I just smiled and said I needed a break from technology. I would be gone for 4 days and 3 nights, enough time for me to hopefully reset and reevaluate my life and what I was doing with it. As I drove deeper into the park, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement. Maybe Dr. Chen was right. Maybe this was exactly what I needed. I soon arrived at the trailhead and parked my car. As I stepped out, the crisp mountain air filled my lungs, and for a moment I felt more alive than I had in months. I shouldered my backpack, double-checked my map and compass, and set off down the trail. The first few hours were challenging. I was out of shape, and the steep inclines had my legs burning and my lungs working overtime. But with each step, each breath of fresh air, I felt a little stronger, a little more confident. As the day wore on, I found myself appreciating the beauty around me. The towering pines, the glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance, the occasional deer or squirrel darting across my path. I even managed to snap a few photos with the disposable camera I had brought along. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail, a sense of unease began to creep in. The friendly forest of the afternoon seemed to transform, becoming denser, more ominous. Shadows danced at the corners of my vision, and every snapping twig made me jump. I realized with a sinking feeling that I had miscalculated. I wasn't going to reach the campsite before nightfall. Panic began to set in as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. I fumbled with my flashlight, the beam seeming pitifully small against the encompassing darkness. "Okay, Lily," I muttered to myself, trying to keep calm. "You can do this, just a little further." But as the minutes ticked by, turning into hours, I knew I was lost. The trail had become indistinct, and in the darkness every tree looked the same. I was exhausted, scared, and beginning to shiver in the cool night air. Finally, I stumbled into a small clearing. There, in the center, was a fire pit surrounded by a few logs for seating. This had to be the campsite. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The forest around me seemed to be coming alive with nighttime sounds. Hoots, howls, and rustles echoed through the trees, each noise making me more and more anxious. With shaking hands, I set up my tent, building a small fire in front of it. The flickering flames provided little comfort against the pressing darkness beyond. Exhausted, I crawled into my tent and curled up in my sleeping bag, trying to will myself to sleep. But every sound outside seemed magnified, every shadow cast by the dying fire menacing. I was dozing, about to drift off, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching outside. My eyes shot open and I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. I waited, holding my breath. I heard the sound again. Someone or something was definitely walking around my tent. It sounded like they, whatever they were trying to be quiet, stealthy. My heart pounded in my chest so loudly I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I held my breath, straining my ears to catch any sound, any clue as to what was circling my tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They paused occasionally as if the creature was listening, waiting. I wanted to call out, to scare it away, but fear had frozen my voice in my throat. As the night wore on, the footsteps continued their eerie patrol. Sometimes they'd fade away, only to return louder than ever. Other times they'd stop right outside my tent, so close I could hear what sounded like breathing. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, my mind conjuring up all sorts of terrifying possibilities. Was it a bear, a mountain lion, or something else? My brother's words echoed in my mind. You might encounter something you're not prepared for. That went on for hours in inconsistent bursts until I finally convinced myself it was an animal, scavenging for scraps or investigating my tent. By dawn I was dozing again, and the noise had finally stopped. I told myself I would sleep for an hour or two, giving myself time to rest up. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were a chaotic swirl of dark forests and unseen creatures. I ran through endless trees, always pursued, never escaping. Just as something was about to catch me, I jolted awake. I woke up disoriented and exhausted and started to panic before remembering where I was. I needed to start hiking back, now. But when I exited the tent, I saw that the sun was already setting. How was that possible? I had only meant to sleep for a couple of hours. To say I was upset would be an understatement. I hesitated for a moment, trying to decide what to do. I wanted to go home. I wanted to leave, see how far I could get. But deep down, I knew I'd instantly get lost and probably end up in a worse situation. I looked around the campsite, trying to gather my thoughts. In the daylight, it looked different, smaller, less menacing. But there was something off about it. It took me a moment to realize what it was. There were no footprints. The ground around my tent was undisturbed, save for my own tracks. Whatever had been circling my tent all night had left no trace. A chill ran down my spine as I considered the implications. Had it all been in my head? I shook off the thought and began collecting as much wood as I could to build a big fire, and prepared to hunker down for another night. The light from the sun seemed to disappear unfathomably fast. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned my back to the forest, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, but whenever I spun around, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. By the time I had a good fire going, night had fallen completely. I sat as close to the flames as I dared, drawing comfort from its warmth and light. But the darkness beyond seemed to press in, held at bay only by the flickering firelight. I tried to distract myself by going over my supplies, planning out my hike back in the morning, but my mind kept wandering, replaying the events of the previous night. What had been out there, and why hadn't it left any tracks? As the fire began to die down, I reluctantly prepared for another night in the tent. This time I brought a large branch in with me, clutching it like a child might hold a teddy bear. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it made me feel a little safer. The third night was problematic. I sat awake in my tent for hours after the sun went down, waiting. I'd left the fire going for as long as the wood lasted. I know this isn't proper camping etiquette, but I was improvising and I was absolutely terrified. The darkness around me seemed to crush the light from the fire, making it seem small and ineffective, a tiny candle in a sea of shadows. For hours I sat there, listening, afraid. Finally I realized I was just being ridiculous, that what I had heard the night before was nothing to fear, that my subconscious was just playing tricks on me, keeping me alert for no reason. So I bundled myself up and laid down, and I heard it. Softly at first, a footstep, then 2, 3, growing louder, bolder. I sat up, my eyes widening and my breath quickening. What was that? I had to know. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was operating purely out of fear. I heard the noise. It sounded like something running around and around my tent. Suddenly the side of my tent pushed in as if someone was slapping it from the outside. "Hey!" I yelled, startled beyond belief. "Hey! I'm awake! I'm in here!" I tried to stand, tripping myself up in my sleeping bag in the process, and stumbled into the front of the tent. Scrambling up, I swiftly unzipped the flap and ran outside with my flashlight. I saw a shape scurry away, and against all better judgment, I followed. And there, standing at the edge of the firelight, barely visible, was the silhouette of a person. They were standing with their back towards me. Their arms were hanging in strange positions by their sides, their head pointed straight away from me. I took a step towards them, and a branch cracked underneath me. The sound seemed to startle the person, and they turned their head ever so slightly. "Hey," I said again, my voice shaking. "What are you doing?" And then a sound rose up, a sound that crescendoed into a scream. It was laughter, but unlike any laughter I had ever heard before. It echoed around me, rattling in my skull, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I ran, leaping into my tent, zipping it up behind me, curling into my sleeping bag, terrified beyond words. And the world around me exploded, or rather imploded. The walls of the tent shook like hundreds of hands were slapping it, poking it, punching it. Outside, what sounded like dozens of people running around shattered the silence. I cowered in my sleeping bag, hands clamped over my ears, eyes squeezed shut. But even through my covered ears I could hear voices, whispers, shouts, giggles, all blending together into a cacophony of madness. "Come out," a sing-song voice called. "We just want to play," another chimed in. "Forever and ever and ever," a chorus of voices chanted. I don't know how long it went on, hours maybe, or maybe just minutes that stretched into eternity. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that hellish night. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken terror, because the next thing I knew, I was opening my eyes to the dim light of dawn filtering through the tent fabric. For a moment I lay there, disoriented. Had it all been a nightmare? But as I sat up, the events of the night came rushing back, along with a fresh wave of fear. I don't know how or when I fell asleep. I think I might have passed out. Either way, I woke up to a reddish glow encompassing my surroundings. I sat up and ran outside, looking around for proof of what I had heard. But there was nothing, no footprints, handprints, or any disturbance at all. The campsite looked exactly as it had the day before. The fire pit was cold, the ashes undisturbed. The logs around it sat peacefully, showing no signs of the chaos I'd heard in the night. I stood there, my mind reeling. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my grip on reality? The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Stress, isolation, and overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew. I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. This is insane, I muttered to myself, throwing my things chaotically into my bag. I would leave today, even in the dark if I had to. I couldn't stay another night here. I was just starting to take down the tent when I heard it, a sound in the distance, perhaps carried to me by the wind which was picking up around me. Help me, please, oh no, help me. The voice was filled with such raw terror that it cut through my own fear. It sounded like a woman, young, maybe even a teenager. Without thinking, I dropped the tent pole and turned towards the sound. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Where are you?" "Please," the voice came again, closer this time. "I'm lost. I'm scared." I reacted more out of instinct than logic and began running towards the sound before realizing that I was in no position to help whoever was screaming. Still, I tried to locate the source of the sound, following the voice for about 30 minutes. As I ran, the forest seemed to grow denser, darker. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The ground became uneven, roots and rocks threatening to trip me with every step. "Where are you?" I yelled, looking around me through the maze of trees. "I'm here. Where are you?" The voice kept calling, always seeming just out of reach. I pushed on, driven by a mix of adrenaline and a desperate need to not be alone in this nightmare. Suddenly, I burst into a small clearing. The voice had stopped. I spun around, trying to get my bearings. "Hello?" I called again, my voice echoing in the sudden silence. And then I saw her. A young girl, maybe 16 or 17, standing at the edge of the clearing. Her back was to me, long dark hair hanging down, obscuring her face. "Hey," I said, relief flooding through me. "Are you okay? I heard you calling." Slowly, so slowly, she began to turn. As she did, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong, very wrong. As she faced me, I saw that her feet weren't touching the ground. She was floating, suspended a few inches above the forest floor. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were solid black, no whites, no iris, just endless darkness. A wide, unnatural grin split her face, stretching from ear to ear. And then she laughed. The sound that erupted from her throat was inhuman, a cacophony of discordant notes that seemed to shatter the very air around us. It was the same laughter I had heard the night before, but amplified, more terrifying than I could have imagined. Quickly, the screams descended into that deep, unsettling laughter. Frightened beyond belief, I turned and ran back the way I came. The laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, seeming to come from all directions at once. I ran blindly, branches whipping at my face, roots catching at my feet. I didn't know if I was going the right way, didn't care. I just needed to get away. Behind me, I could hear it. The sound of snapping twigs, of leaves crunching underfoot. And always that terrible laughter. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I burst out of the tree line and found myself back at my campsite. I didn't stop to question how I'd found my way back. I just grabbed my pack and uprooted the poles of the tent, thinking that I would just roll it up and carry it back instead of taking the time to fold it neatly and shove it into its bag. Around me, the mountains loomed up like giants, as if I was about to be swallowed whole by nature itself. The sky had darkened, heavy clouds rolling in, promising rain. As I pulled each pole, the tent fell a little, but it was only on the third pole out of 6 that I realized it wasn't falling fully flat. Confused, I peered into the tent and recoiled in horror, too afraid to even scream. There was someone sitting inside, but not just anyone. It was me. Sitting there, pale and gaunt, with an unnaturally wide grin plastered on my face. A single droplet of what looked like blood rolled down from each eye, which, instead of having their usual hazel color, were wholly black. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. Laughter rose up around me, and as I scrambled to my feet, I saw my hand, That was not my hand. Reach out from the tent, followed swiftly by the other, then the head. My face, that was not my face, looked up at me, still smiling, then laughed again. The sound that came from its mouth was inhuman, a mix of nails on a chalkboard and the howl of a dying animal. Its body moved jerkily, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. I screamed. I stood. I ran, and I ran. I didn't even know if I was running the right way. I couldn't even use the sun anymore for guidance since it had almost fully set. The forest blurred around me, trees and shadows melding into a nightmarish landscape. I ran without looking where I was going. I kept looking behind me to see if that thing was following me. I could feel the trees scratching me, pushing against me like they were trying to hold me back, hold me still until that thing came for me. Suddenly a light flashed in my face and I ran into something solid, something dark, something that wrapped around me. I instantly cowered, hiding my face in my hands. Whoa! Oh, please, no, 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 I heard my own voice, terrified, shaking. Hey, calm down, it's okay, you just startled me. Calm down, what's wrong? I looked up and into the concerned blue eyes of a human face, the face of a middle-aged woman to be exact. She was holding me steady. The flashlight she was using lay fallen at our feet, creating strange shadows behind us. I looked back, fearful of what I might see, but there was nothing, only trees swaying slowly in the slight breeze. Hey, she said again, was that you, screaming? I came out here to check. I couldn't speak, I was too terrified. I shook my head. Were you camping out there alone? She asked, letting me go and bending down to retrieve the flashlight. I nodded, then began crying. The tears came suddenly, a dam breaking. All the fear, all the confusion of the past few days poured out of me in great, heaving sobs. The woman awkwardly patted my shoulder, clearly unsure how to handle a young woman breaking down in front of her. Hey, it's okay, it can be spooky out here. Come on, my vehicle is right over there. She gestured with her head back behind her. I wiped my nose and blinked, finally finding my voice. Who are you? She glanced at me, then away. I'm, a forest ranger. But she didn't look like one. She was wearing a smooth black pantsuit and white shirt, and her shoes were polished leather, not hiking boots. In the beam of the flashlight, I could see that her suit was immaculate, not a speck of dirt or a wrinkle to be seen. It was as if she had just stepped out of an office, not been trekking through the woods. Come on, she said again, taking my pack and swinging it onto her back. As she did so, her jacket flapped slightly, and I saw what looked like a handgun strapped to her belt. 1,000 questions raced through my mind. Who was this woman really? What was she doing out here, dressed like that? But exhaustion and relief overwhelmed my curiosity. Okay, I said, looking back behind me again. How did you find me? She shrugged. Good hearing. We entered a small clearing, and I saw a matte black SUV with tinted windows, headlights flaring, engine idling, parked in the middle of it. It was sleek, expensive-looking, definitely not standard issue for park rangers. She popped the trunk and threw my bag in as I climbed into the passenger side seat. The interior was all black leather and gleaming technology. It smelled new, with a faint undertone of something else. Ozone, maybe? She climbed into the driver's seat and asked me where she should take me. I told her the lot number, and we were on our way. As we drove, I kept sneaking glances at my mysterious rescuer. Her face was impassive, eyes fixed on the road ahead. In the glow of the dashboard lights, I could see that her hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. Who goes hiking with hair product? After a few moments, she flipped the cubby between us open and pulled out a bag. Trail mix? She asked, holding out the bag to me. I took it gratefully and began eating. The familiar salty crunch was comforting, grounding me back in reality after the surreal horrors of the past few days. I licked my fingers, then looked back at her, curiosity finally overcoming my fear and exhaustion. So, are you really a ranger? She looked at me, then back to the road, but still I stared at her, transfixed. She looked exhausted, her blonde hair disheveled and dirty from the forest. I. The SUV jerked to a sudden stop, and the woman let out a slow, deep breath. Her eyes narrowed, and she looked over at me, then back to the dirt trail in front of us. I followed her gaze, feeling the fear churning up inside me. And there, in the middle of the road, was me. The me that was not me. Its limbs hung limply, as if they were broken, and that sickly smile was still plastered across the face. It waved. The woman looked back at me, then back at the thing that was not me, then back at me. I met her gaze. In her eyes I saw not fear but resignation, like she'd seen this before. "I don't get compensated enough for this," the woman muttered, before slamming her foot on the accelerator straight towards the thing. We both felt the impact. The car bounced over the body and the woman kept driving, but around us, in between the trees, stirred into the darkness. Laughter boiled up, manic and persistent. I gripped the edges of my seat, knuckles white, as we sped down the dirt road. The woman's face was set in grim determination, her hands steady on the wheel as she navigated the twists and turns at a speed that seemed suicidal. What was that thing?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "You're better off not knowing." We drove in silence after that, the only sound the rumble of the engine and the occasional crackle of what sounded like a radio, though I couldn't see one. We reached the lot in silence, bathed in the first light of the rising sun. The woman beside me seemed to be deep in thought, distracted. I was still scared, but hopeful that whatever that thing was, it was now gone, or at least so badly injured that it would not return. The SUV slowed to a stop and the woman popped the trunk and hopped out. She walked to the back and grabbed my pack as I jumped out. She handed it to me and I took it, then thanked her for everything. "No problem," she said, "all in a day's work." Her lips quivered as if she was about to smile. I turned to leave, but she spoke up again. "Hey," I turned to face her again, "if you ever want to talk about what you saw or, just talk, call me." She held out a card. I took it and looked down at it. It was matte black and only had a single number written on it. There was no area code. "Than," I began, but I heard a door slam and looked up. The woman was already back in her car. She waved at me, then sped off back the way we had come, back towards that thing. I shoved the card in my pocket, climbed into my car, and left, breathing a sigh of relief as I passed through the park gates and back into the real world. The drive home was a blur. I kept expecting to see that thing, that not me, standing in the middle of the road, or the mysterious ranger following me in her sleek black SUV. But there was nothing, just normal traffic and the gradually changing landscape as I left the mountains behind. I still haven't told anyone about what happened, even when they asked why I refused to go hiking ever again. I just shrug and tell them it wasn't my thing, that I prefer the safety and comfort of the city. Every so often, though, I'll pull out the card, my fingers lingering over my phone, wondering if I should call, wondering who the woman really was, and if she'd really be able to explain what happened to me. For weeks after the incident, I jumped at every unexpected sound, flinched at every shadow. I couldn't sleep with the lights off, couldn't close my eyes in the shower. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Stress, exhaustion, and overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. My brother noticed the change in me almost immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said when I showed up at his place the day after I got back. I just mumbled something about a rough trip and changed the subject. I threw myself into work, into socializing, into anything that would keep my mind occupied. I started seeing Dr. Chen more frequently, though I never told her the whole story. How could I? She'd think I was losing my mind. Sometimes I think I am. But then I remember the woman in the black suit, the one who saved me. She had seen it too, hadn't she? She knew something about what was out there in those woods. One night, about 3 months after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to dial the number. My hand was shaking as I held the phone to my ear, listening to it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Hello? The voice that answered was familiar, the same calm, slightly weary tone of the woman who had rescued me. Hi, I said, my own voice trembling slightly. I don't know if you remember me, but— The hiker, she interrupted. From the Sierra National Forest, I remember. There was a pause, and I could hear muffled voices in the background, the sound of papers shuffling. Listen, she said, her voice lowered. I shouldn't be talking to you about this, but meet me at the cafe just outside the park entrance, tomorrow, 7 p.m. Come alone. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I spent the next 24 hours in a state of nervous anticipation. Part of me was terrified to go back anywhere near those mountains, but a larger part needed answers. I needed to know that I wasn't losing my mind, that what I had experienced was real. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived, just a few tourists sipping lattes and scrolling through their phones. I slid into a booth near the back, my eyes darting nervously to the door every few seconds. At exactly 7 p.m. she walked in. She looked exactly the same, black suit, blonde hair now neatly styled, an air of quiet authority about her. She slid into the seat across from me without a word. For a long moment we just stared at each other. Then she spoke. What you encountered in those woods, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, it's not something that can be easily explained. There are things out there that most people don't know about, things that defy our understanding of reality. I leaned in, hanging on her every word. What was it, that thing that looked like me? She shook her head. We don't have a name for them, at least not one that you'd understand. They're entities, beings from somewhere else, somewhere beyond. Beyond what? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Beyond everything, she replied. Beyond our world, our understanding of existence itself. I sat back, my mind reeling. Who are you? Really? A small, tired smile crossed her face. Let's just say I work for an organization that deals with unusual phenomena. We try to keep people safe from things they're not ready to understand. Are there more of those things out there? She nodded grimly. More than you could imagine. They're drawn to certain places, certain people. People like you. Like me, I echoed, a chill running down my spine. People who are sensitive, who can perceive things others can't. It's why you were able to see it, to interact with it. I shook my head, trying to process all of this. What do I do now? How do I go back to normal after knowing all this? She reached across the table, placing a hand on my arm. Her touch was surprisingly warm, comforting. You can't, but you can learn to live with it, to protect yourself. From her pocket she pulled out a small metallic object. It looked like a coin, but with strange swirling symbols etched into its surface. Keep this with you, she said, pressing it into my palm. It won't stop you from seeing them, but it will offer some protection. They won't be able to interact with you directly. I closed my fingers around the coin, feeling its weight, its warmth. Thank you, I whispered. She stood up, straightening her jacket. I have to go. But remember, you're not alone in this. There are others out there like you, like us. Stay vigilant, stay safe. With that, she turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a world that suddenly seemed much larger, much stranger, and much more dangerous than I had ever imagined. Since that night, I've been learning to live with my new reality. The coin never leaves my possession, a constant reminder of what's out there. I've started researching, cautiously reaching out to others who've had similar experiences. Sometimes late at night I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that moves wrong, a face that's not quite human. But I'm not as scared anymore. I'm vigilant. I'm prepared. And I know now that I'm not alone in this. But still, every time I see the mountains looming on the horizon, I can't help but shudder. Because I know what's out there, waiting in the deep, dark woods. And I know that one day I might have to face it again. Until then, I'll keep the coin close, keep my eyes open, and hope that the woman in the black suit is out there, keeping watch over those who stumble into the spaces between our world and the beyond. Because now I know the truth. I'm not afraid of the dark. That was a lie. There are things out there worth being afraid of, things beyond our wildest imagination. And knowledge is the most terrifying thing of all. The digital clock on my nightstand blinked 2:37 a.m., its red glow a stark contrast to the darkness enveloping my bedroom. I rubbed my eyes, fighting the exhaustion that threatened to pull me back into a restless slumber. My daughter Lily lay next to me, her small body curled up against mine, her breathing labored and wheezy. At 4 years old, she had been battling severe asthma attacks all winter, each one more frightening than the last. I carefully extricated myself from the tangle of blankets, making sure not to disturb Lily. The hardwood floor creaked beneath my feet as I made my way to the bathroom, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet house. I splashed cold water on my face, trying to shock myself into alertness. As I looked up at my reflection in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. Dark circles ringed my eyes, and worry lines had etched themselves deeply into my forehead. The past few months had taken their toll, not just on Lily, but on our entire family. My husband, Mark, was sound asleep in the guest room. We had decided to take turns staying with Lily during her bad nights, allowing at least one of us to get some uninterrupted rest. Tonight was my shift, and I was determined to stay vigilant. Lily's inhaler sat on the bedside table, a constant reminder of the precarious nature of her health. As I made my way back to the bedroom, a flicker of movement outside the living room window caught my eye. I paused, my heart rate quickening. Our house sat on the outskirts of a small town in rural Northern California, bordered by dense woods that always seemed to harbor secrets. During the day, the forest was a playground for Lily, full of wonder and adventure. But at night it transformed into something altogether different, a realm of shadows and unknown dangers. I approached the window cautiously, my bare feet silent on the cool floor. The curtains were partially open, offering a view of our backyard and the tree line beyond. A pale, silvery light bathed the scene, and it took me a moment to realize it was coming from the full moon hanging low in the sky. The branches of the old oak trees swayed gently in the breeze, creating shifting patterns of darkness on the ground. At first I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The yard was empty, save for Lily's swing set and the rusty barbecue grill we kept meaning to replace. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I caught sight of something moving at the edge of the woods. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned closer to the window, my nose almost touching the cold glass. There, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was hunched over, its movements jerky and unnatural. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it might be a person, perhaps an intruder creeping around our property. But as I watched, the figure seemed to shift. 1 second it appeared to be a large dog, its shaggy coat gleaming in the moonlight. Then, in the blink of an eye, it transformed into something smaller, a fox perhaps, or a coyote. I rubbed my eyes, certain that exhaustion was playing tricks on my mind. When I looked again, the creature had changed once more. Now it resembled a bear cub, lumbering awkwardly towards the edge of our yard. A chill ran down my spine, and goosebumps erupted across my arms. What I was seeing was impossible, and yet I couldn't deny the evidence before my eyes. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be struggling to maintain a consistent form. It flickered between shapes like a faulty hologram, never settling on a single appearance for more than a few seconds. I wanted to look away, to convince myself that this was nothing more than a vivid hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But I found myself transfixed, unable to tear my gaze from the otherworldly spectacle unfolding in my backyard. The creature continued its approach, each transformation more bizarre than the last. One moment it was a deer, elegant and graceful despite its uneven gait. The next it had shrunk down to the size of a raccoon, its masked face turning towards the house as if it sensed my presence. I held my breath, afraid that even the slightest movement might alert it to my watching. As it drew closer to the house, I began to notice other unsettling details. The creature's body seemed to be in a constant state of flux, not just in its overall shape, but in its very substance. Parts of it appeared to dissolve into mist, only to reform seconds later. Patches of fur gave way to scales, then to something that looked disturbingly like human skin. It was as if the laws of nature had ceased to apply, allowing this impossible being to exist in defiance of everything I thought I knew about the world. A soft whimper from the bedroom snapped me out of my trance. Lily was stirring, likely in need of her inhaler. I hesitated, torn between my maternal instincts and my morbid fascination with the creature outside. In the end, Lily's needs won out. I forced myself to turn away from the window, my heart pounding as I hurried back to the bedroom. Lily was sitting up in bed, her small chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. I pushed all thoughts of the shape-shifting creature from my mind, focusing entirely on my daughter. With practiced movements, I helped her use the inhaler, counting the seconds between puffs and rubbing her back soothingly. "It's okay, sweetie," I murmured, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Just breathe. Mommy's here." Gradually, Lily's breathing eased and she relaxed against me. I held her close, grateful for the warmth of her small body and the steady beat of her heart. We sat like that for several minutes, the quiet of the night broken only by the soft sound of her breathing. When I was sure Lily had fallen back asleep, I gently laid her down and tucked the blankets around her. Then, with a mixture of dread and curiosity, I crept back to the living room window. The yard was empty. The shape-shifting creature, if it had ever truly been there, was gone. The woods beyond stood silent and still, betraying no hint of the impossible thing I'd witnessed. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, suddenly doubting my own sanity. Had it all been a dream, some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and worry? I stayed by the window for a long time, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the gentle sway of branches in the night breeze and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. Eventually, I forced myself to return to bed, my mind racing with questions I had no answers for. As I lay beside Lily, listening to the soft wheeze of her breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The world I thought I knew, a world of logic and reason, where shape-shifting creatures existed only in stories, had been irrevocably altered. Sunlight streamed through the bedroom window, painting warm stripes across the rumpled bed sheets. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented. Lily was still curled up beside me, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The events of the night before came rushing back, and I sat up abruptly, my heart pounding. Had it all been a dream? The shape-shifting creature in the woods, morphing from one impossible form to another, it seemed too fantastical to be real. And yet the memory was vivid, etched into my mind with a clarity that no ordinary dream could match. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lily, and made my way to the living room. The house was quiet, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the gentle ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I approached the window with trepidation, half expecting to see some evidence of last night's otherworldly visitor. But the yard looked exactly as it always did. Lily's swing set stood silent in the morning light, dew glistening on the grass. The woods beyond were a wall of green, leaves rustling gently in the breeze. There was no sign of anything unusual, no hint that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see any detail that might confirm what I'd witnessed. But there was nothing, no footprints, no disturbed earth, not even a broken twig. I felt a mix of relief and disappointment wash over me. Part of me had hoped for some tangible proof, something to assure me that I wasn't losing my mind. "Morning, hun." Mark's voice startled me, and I spun around to find him standing in the doorway, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "Everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding completely insane? Mark was a practical man, an engineer who dealt in facts and figures. Would he even believe me? I'm not sure, I finally said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. I think I saw something last night out in the woods. Mark's brow furrowed with concern. He set his coffee down and came to stand beside me at the window. What kind of something? I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. It was like nothing I've ever seen before. It kept changing shape, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. One minute it looked like a dog, then a bear, then, I don't know. It was impossible. I watched Mark's face carefully as I spoke, looking for signs of disbelief or worry. But his expression remained neutral, his eyes scanning the tree line as if he might spot the creature himself. Are you sure you weren't dreaming? He asked gently. You've been under a lot of stress lately with Lily's condition and everything. I shook my head emphatically. No, Mark, I was wide awake. I know what I saw. He turned to face me then, his eyes searching mine. I could see the conflict in his expression, the desire to believe me warring with his inherent skepticism. Finally, he sighed and pulled me into a hug. Okay, he said softly. If you say you saw something, then you saw something. We'll figure this out together. I melted into his embrace, relief flooding through me. Even if he didn't fully believe me, at least he wasn't dismissing my experience outright. We stood there for a long moment, the warmth of the morning sun washing over us. The peaceful moment was shattered by a piercing scream from Lily's room. We both jumped, exchanging a panicked look before rushing down the hallway. I burst into the bedroom, my heart in my throat, to find Lily sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. Sweetie, what's wrong? I asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and pulling her into my arms. She was trembling, her small body racked with sobs. The monster, she choked out between gasps. It was at the window. I felt a chill run down my spine. Mark knelt beside the bed, his hand on Lily's back. What monster, honey? He asked, his voice calm despite the worry in his eyes. Lily hiccuped, struggling to catch her breath. I reached for her inhaler, but she shook her head. This wasn't an asthma attack. This was pure fear. It kept changing, she whispered. First it was a big doggy, then a bear, then it looked like a person, but all wrong. I exchanged a shocked glance with Mark. There was no way Lily could have overheard our conversation in the living room, and yet she was describing exactly what I had seen the night before. When did you see this, Lily? Mark asked, his voice gentle but insistent. Just now, she sniffled. I woke up and it was looking in the window, but when I screamed, it ran away. I was on my feet in an instant, rushing to the window, but just like in the backyard, there was no sign of any disturbance. The grass outside Lily's window was undisturbed, the flower beds intact. If something had been there, it had left no trace. Mark joined me at the window, his expression troubled. I don't see anything, he murmured, low enough that Lily couldn't hear. Are you sure she wasn't just having a nightmare? I shook my head, my mind racing. She described exactly what I saw last night, Mark, exactly. How is that possible if it was just a dream? He had no answer for that. We both turned back to Lily, who was clutching her stuffed rabbit to her chest, her eyes still wide with fear. It's okay, sweetie, I said, forcing a smile. There's nothing out there now. You're safe. But even as I spoke the words, I knew they might be a lie. Something was out there, something that defied explanation, and for some reason it seemed to be drawn to our family. As I held Lily close, trying to calm her racing heart, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives had irrevocably changed. The boundary between the world we knew and something far stranger had been breached, and I had no idea how to protect my family from what might come next. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of nervous energy and hushed conversations. Mark called in sick to work, a rarity for him, citing a family emergency. In a way, I supposed that's exactly what this was, though I doubted his boss would understand if we tried to explain the true nature of our situation. Lily refused to be left alone, clinging to either Mark or me with a desperation that broke my heart. Her usual vibrant chatter was replaced by a watchful silence, her eyes constantly darting to the windows as if expecting the shape-shifting creature to reappear at any moment. Once we'd managed to get some breakfast into her, a feat that required far more coaxing than usual, Mark and I retreated to the kitchen to discuss our next steps. The normality of the scene, dirty dishes in the sink, the hum of the refrigerator, sunlight streaming through the window, felt surreal in contrast to the otherworldly events we were grappling with. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with," Mark said, his voice low as he glanced towards the living room where Lily was curled up on the couch, half-heartedly watching cartoons. "If this thing is real, and I'm not saying I'm entirely convinced yet, then we need to know what it is and why it's here." I nodded, grateful for his pragmatic approach. It was so much easier to focus on concrete steps than to dwell on the terrifying implications of what we'd seen. "Where do we even start?" I asked. "It's not like we can Google shape-shifting monster in the backyard and get any reliable information." Mark's lips quirked in a humorless smile. "Actually, that might not be a bad place to start. At the very least, we might find some local legends or folklore that could give us a clue. But first, I think we need to take a look around outside. If this thing was really here, it might have left some kind of trace." The idea of going out into the yard, let alone the woods beyond, sent a shiver down my spine. But Mark was right. We needed more information, and the scene of the sightings was the most logical place to begin. "What about Lily?" I asked, glancing towards the living room. "I don't want to leave her alone, but I don't think we should take her out there either." Mark considered for a moment. "We'll have to take turns. One of us can search while the other stays with her. We'll cover more ground that way anyway." I agreed, though the thought of either of us going out there alone made my stomach churn with anxiety. We quickly worked out a plan. Mark would take the first shift outside while I stayed with Lily. Then we'd switch. We'd focus on the areas where the creature had been seen, the edge of the woods visible from the living room window, and the area outside Lily's bedroom. As Mark prepared to head outside, gathering a flashlight and his phone for pictures, I pulled him into a tight hug. "Be careful," I whispered, suddenly terrified that this might be the last time I saw him. What if the creature was still out there, waiting? He squeezed me back, his solid presence momentarily calming my frayed nerves. "I will," he promised. "I'll stay inside of the house and keep my phone on me. If I see anything unusual, I'll come right back inside." With one last reassuring smile, Mark headed out the back door. I watched through the kitchen window as he made his way across the yard, his movements careful and deliberate. When he reached the tree line, he paused, scanning the area before slowly pushing aside a low-hanging branch and stepping into the shadows of the forest. I forced myself to turn away from the window and went to join Lily in the living room. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide and questioning. "Where's Daddy going?" she asked, her voice small and worried. I sat down beside her, pulling her close. "Daddy's just checking things out in the backyard," I said, trying to keep my voice light and reassuring. "He wants to make sure everything's safe." Lily nodded, but I could feel the tension in her small body. "Is the monster going to come back?" she whispered. My heart ached at the fear in her voice. "I don't know, sweetie," I answered honestly. "But Daddy and I are here to protect you. You're safe with us." We sat in silence for a while, the cheerful sounds of the cartoon on TV a stark contrast to the worry that hung heavy in the air. I found myself straining to hear any sound from outside, dreading the possibility of a shout or any sign that Mark was in trouble. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 20 minutes, I heard the back door open. Lily stiffened beside me, but I gave her a reassuring squeeze before standing up to meet Mark in the kitchen. He was slightly out of breath, leaves and twigs clinging to his clothes, but otherwise appeared unharmed. The relief I felt was almost dizzying. "Did you find anything?" I asked in a low voice, mindful of Lily's presence in the next room. Mark ran a hand through his hair, dislodging a small twig. Nothing concrete, he said, frustration evident in his tone. There are some areas where the underbrush is trampled down, but that could be from deer or other wildlife. I did find this, though. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something dark and matted. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. Is that fur? I asked, leaning in for a closer look. Mark nodded. I think so. But here's the weird part. It doesn't look like it belongs to any animal I'm familiar with. And I found it snagged on a branch right at the spot where you said you saw the creature last night. I reached out to touch the clump of fur, then hesitated. Should we be handling this? What if it's, I don't know, dangerous somehow? I thought about that, Mark admitted, but I figured we need all the evidence we can get. I'm going to put it in a plastic bag and see if we can get it analyzed somehow. As he spoke, he pulled a Ziploc bag from a drawer and carefully deposited the fur inside. Your turn to take a look outside, he said, sealing the bag. I'll stay with Lily. I nodded, steeling myself for what I might find. As I prepared to head out, gathering a jacket and my own flashlight, a thought struck me. Mark, I said, turning back to him, what if this thing isn't just randomly wandering around? What if it's here for a reason? The implication hung heavy between us. If the creature had a purpose, if it was drawn to our home specifically, then our situation was potentially far more dangerous than we'd initially thought. Mark's expression grew grim. All the more reason to figure out what we're dealing with, he said. Be careful out there, and don't take any unnecessary risks. With a nod, I stepped out into the backyard. The late morning sun was high overhead, casting dappled shadows through the leaves. Everything looked so normal, so mundane, that for a moment I could almost believe that the events of the past night had been nothing more than a shared delusion. But as I approached the tree line, that sense of normalcy began to fade. The woods seemed darker than they should be, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig underfoot sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I tried to retrace the path the creature had taken based on what I'd seen from the window. The underbrush was indeed trampled in places, but as Mark had noted, there was no way to be sure this wasn't just the result of normal wildlife activity. As I pushed deeper into the woods, I found myself at the base of a large oak tree. Its gnarled roots snaked across the forest floor, and its trunk was so wide that my arms wouldn't have reached even halfway around it. Something about the tree drew my attention, and I stepped closer, running my hand along its rough bark. That's when I saw it, a series of deep gouges in the wood, too uniform to be natural and too large to have been made by any normal forest animal. My breath caught in my throat as I traced the marks with my fingers. They were about chest height on me and looked almost like claw marks, but larger and deeper than anything a bear or mountain lion could have made. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking as I snapped several pictures of the marks. As I lowered the phone, movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, I turned my head. At first I saw nothing but trees and underbrush, but then, as if emerging from the very fabric of the forest itself, a shape began to coalesce. It was indistinct, seeming to shift and waver like a mirage, but there was no mistaking the intelligence in the eyes that met mine. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. We stared at each other, human and something else. I felt no malevolence from the creature, but rather a sense of intense curiosity, tinged with something that might have been sadness. Then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, it was gone. The forest seemed to exhale, leaves rustling in a sudden breeze, and I was left alone with nothing but the pounding of my own heart and the lingering sense that I had just witnessed something both terrible and wonderful. On shaky legs, I made my way back to the house, my mind reeling. I had come out here looking for answers, but instead, I had found only more questions. One thing was certain, though. Whatever this creature was, it was real, and it was connected to us somehow. The challenge now would be figuring out why and what it wanted from us. As I reached the back door, I paused, taking a deep breath to compose myself. Mark and Lily were waiting inside, and they would need me to be strong to help make sense of this impossible situation. With one last look at the now innocent-seeming woods, I stepped back into the house, ready to share my experience and face whatever might come next. The kitchen was quiet as I recounted my experience in the woods to Mark. Lily had finally fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from the stress and fear of the morning. As I described the claw marks on the tree and my brief encounter with this shape-shifting creature, I watched Mark's expression shift from skepticism to concern, and finally to a kind of grim determination. "We need help," he said when I had finished. "This is way beyond anything we can handle on our own." I nodded, relief flooding through me at his words. As much as I had hoped we could resolve this situation quietly, the reality of what we were facing was too big, too strange to tackle alone. "But who can we turn to?" I asked. "The police? They'd think we were crazy." Mark shook his head. "No, not the police. We need someone with specialized knowledge, someone who might have encountered something like this before, or at least be open to the possibility." He pulled out his phone and began searching. After a few minutes he looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "There's a professor at the State University, Dr. Elena Vasquez. She specializes in folklore and cryptozoology. Some of her published work deals with shapeshifter legends from various cultures. It's a long shot, but she might be able to help us make sense of what's going on." I leaned over to look at the article on his phone, showing a photo of a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Do you think she'd believe us?" "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But right now, she's our best option. I'm going to send her an email, see if we can set up a meeting." As Mark composed the email, carefully wording our situation to sound as credible as possible without revealing too much, I checked on Lily. She was still asleep, her brow furrowed even in rest. I gently smoothed her hair, wishing I could erase the fear and confusion of the past day. "Sent," Mark said quietly, coming to stand beside me. "Now we wait and hope she responds." The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous anticipation. We tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Lily's sake, but there was no denying the tension that filled the house. Every unexpected sound made us jump, and we found ourselves constantly checking the windows, half expecting to see the creature watching us. As evening approached, bringing with it long shadows and a renewed sense of vulnerability, Mark's phone chimed with an incoming email. We both froze, exchanging a look of mingled hope and apprehension. "It's from Dr. Vasquez," Mark said, his voice tight with tension as he opened the message. I held my breath as his eyes scanned the screen. Finally, he looked up, a small smile breaking through his worried expression. "She wants to meet with us tomorrow afternoon at her office on campus." The relief I felt was tempered by a new wave of anxiety. Meeting with Dr. Vasquez meant leaving the house, leaving Lily. The thought of exposing ourselves and potentially our daughter to whatever danger might be lurking out there was terrifying. But we had no choice. We needed answers, and Dr. Vasquez was our best hope of finding them. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a beautiful day that seemed to mock the fear and uncertainty roiling within us. We had decided that Mark would stay home with Lily while I met with Dr. Vasquez. As much as I hated the idea of facing this alone, we both agreed it was safer to have one of us remain at the house at all times. As I prepared to leave, gathering the bagged fur sample and my phone with the photos of the claw marks, Lily clung to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't go, Mommy," she pleaded. "What if the monster comes back?" I knelt down to her level, cupping her small face in my hands. "Daddy will be here with you, sweetie, and I'm going to talk to someone who might be able to help us understand what's happening. I'll be back before you know it. I promise." She nodded bravely, but I could see the tears threatening to spill from her eyes. I pulled her into a tight hug, wishing more than anything that I could shield her from all of this. The drive to the university was tense, my eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something impossible following me. But nothing out of the ordinary occurred, and soon I found myself walking across the sun-drenched campus, following signs to the anthropology department. Dr. Vasquez's office was tucked away at the end of a long hallway lined with display cases filled with artifacts and replicas of ancient tools. I paused outside her door, taking a deep breath to steady myself before knocking. "Come in," a voice called from inside. I opened the door to find a small, cluttered office dominated by overflowing bookshelves and a large desk covered in papers and odd trinkets. Dr. Vasquez herself was a striking woman, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent behind round glasses. "Mrs. Carter, I presume," she said, rising to shake my hand. "Please have a seat. Your email was intriguing, to say the least." I sat down, suddenly unsure of where to begin. How does one explain the impossible to a stranger, even one who supposedly specializes in the unusual? Dr. Vasquez seemed to sense my hesitation. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" she suggested gently. "Tell me exactly what you and your family have experienced." And so I did. I recounted the events of the past 2 days, from my first sighting of the creature to our discoveries in the woods. As I spoke, Dr. Vasquez listened intently, her expression giving nothing away. When I mentioned the fur sample and the photos of the claw marks, her eyebrows raised slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Finally, when I had finished my story, she leaned back in her chair, regarding me thoughtfully. "Mrs. Carter," she said after a long moment, "I've heard many strange tales in my line of work. Yours is certainly among the more vivid. Under normal circumstances, I might be inclined to skepticism, but—" She trailed off, her gaze drifting to a framed photo on her desk. I couldn't quite make out the image from where I sat. "But," I prompted, my heart racing. Dr. Vasquez sighed, seeming to come to a decision. "But yours is not the first account I've heard of a creature matching this description. Not in this area, and not recently." My breath caught in my throat. "You mean you've encountered something like this before?" She shook her head. "Not personally, no. But I've been collecting stories, legends, eyewitness accounts, folklore for years. There's a pattern emerging, Mrs. Carter. Something is happening in our world, something that defies conventional explanation." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "I believe you, and I want to help. But I need to see that evidence you mentioned, and if possible, I'd like to visit the site where these encounters occurred." I nodded, relief washing over me at her words. We weren't alone in this anymore. Whatever we were facing, we now had an ally, someone with knowledge and resources beyond our own. As I pulled out the first sample and my phone to show her the photos, I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since this ordeal began. We were taking the first steps towards understanding the mystery that had invaded our lives. But little did I know, the path ahead would lead us into dangers far greater than we could have imagined, and to revelations that would shake the very foundations of our understanding of reality. Dr. Vasquez examined the first sample with intense concentration, turning the plastic bag over in her hands and holding it up to the light. Her office was silent, save for the soft whir of an old desktop computer and the distant murmur of students in the hallway outside. "Fascinating," she murmured, almost to herself. "The structure is unlike anything I've seen before. It's almost as if it's not entirely stable at a molecular level." She looked up at me, her eyes bright with intellectual curiosity. "Mrs. Carter, this is extraordinary. I'd like to run some tests on this sample if you don't mind. I have colleagues in the biology department who might be able to shed some light on its composition." I nodded, relieved to have the strange fur out of my possession. "Of course. Anything that might help us understand what we're dealing with." Dr. Vasquez carefully set the bag aside and turned her attention to my phone, swiping through the photos of the claw marks I had taken. Her brow furrowed as she zoomed in on the details. "These markings," she said slowly, "they're consistent with accounts I've collected from other parts of the country. The size, the depth, the spacing, it all matches. But I've never seen such clear evidence before." A chill ran down my spine at her words. Other parts of the country? You mean this thing, or things like it, have been seen elsewhere? She nodded, her expression grave. Over the past decade, I've been tracking reports of shape-shifting creatures across North America. Most are easily dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but a small percentage, well, they're harder to explain away. Dr. Vasquez stood up and moved to one of the crowded bookshelves, pulling out a thick binder. She set it on the desk between us and opened it, revealing pages of handwritten notes, printed emails, and newspaper clippings. These are some of the more credible accounts I've collected, she explained. A rancher in Montana who saw his cattle transforming into unrecognizable beasts. A hiker in the Appalachians who encountered a creature that shifted between human and animal forms. A family in Oregon whose child befriended what they described as a changeling creature. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the pages. The details varied, but the core of each story was chillingly familiar. What does it all mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Vasquez sighed, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose. That's the question, isn't it? My working theory is that we're dealing with a species, or perhaps multiple species, that have evolved the ability to manipulate their physical form at will. It's an ability that goes far beyond simple camouflage. These creatures seem to be able to restructure their entire bodies at a cellular level. But why, I asked. Why would they reveal themselves to us, and why our family? That's harder to say, she admitted. In some cases, it seems to be simple curiosity. In others, there might be a more purposeful intent. As for why your family specifically, I'd need more information. Has anything unusual happened recently before these sightings began? Any changes in your lives, your environment? I thought back, trying to recall anything out of the ordinary. Suddenly, a memory surfaced. Lily's illness, I said slowly. Her asthma. It started getting worse about a month ago. That's around the time I first noticed strange noises in the woods at night. Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her eyes intent. That could be significant. There are legends in many cultures of shape-shifting creatures drawn to illness or vulnerability. Some are malevolent, seeking to prey on the weak, but others are said to be protective, even healing. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me, fear, hope, confusion. Are you saying this thing might be trying to help Lily? It's a possibility, she said cautiously, but we can't assume anything. These creatures, if they exist as I believe they do, are fundamentally alien to us. Their motivations may be beyond our understanding. We spent the next hour going over more of Dr. Vasquez's research, comparing notes and theories. By the time I left her office, my head was spinning with new information and possibilities. As I drove home, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. We had allies now, and the beginnings of an explanation for what was happening. But the mystery was far from solved, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the brink of something much larger and more profound than we could imagine. I pulled into our driveway just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. As I got out of the car, movement at the edge of the woods caught my eye. For a brief moment, I saw a shimmer in the air, like heat haze on a summer day. Then it was gone, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined it. Inside, I found Mark and Lily in the living room. Lily was curled up next to her father, looking more relaxed than she had in days. When she saw me, her face lit up. "Mommy," she cried, running to hug me. "Guess what? I can breathe better. My chest doesn't hurt anymore." I looked at Mark questioningly. He nodded, a mixture of relief and confusion on his face. "Her breathing has been clearer all afternoon," he confirmed. "It's like her asthma just disappeared." I hugged Lily tightly, my mind racing. Was this a natural improvement in her condition, or something more? I thought of Dr. Vasquez's words about healing shapeshifters and felt a shiver run down my spine. That night, after Lily was asleep, Mark and I sat on the back porch looking out at the darkened woods. I recounted my meeting with Dr. Vasquez, sharing everything we had discussed. "So what do we do now?" Mark asked when I had finished. I took a deep breath, considering our options. I think, I think we need to try to communicate with it, I said finally. If it's been trying to help Lily or if it's just curious about us, maybe we can find a way to understand each other. Mark was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It's risky, he said, but you're right. We can't just ignore this or hope it goes away. Whatever this creature is, it's part of our lives now. We need to face it head on. We stayed up late into the night, planning and preparing. We decided to leave an offering at the edge of the woods, a gesture of peace and an invitation to communicate. Dr. Vasquez had suggested using symbols and simple objects to convey our intentions, as language might be a barrier. The next morning we walked together to the tree line. Lily rode on Mark's shoulders, no longer afraid but filled with a child's curiosity and excitement. We placed our offering, a bowl of fresh fruit, a children's drawing of our family, and a small mirror on a flat rock near the old oak tree with the claw marks. As we stepped back, a breeze rustled through the leaves. The air seemed to thicken, and that now familiar shimmer appeared before us. Slowly a form took shape, not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. Its eyes, deep and intelligent, met ours. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Lily, with the simple acceptance of a child, waved at the creature. "Hello," she said softly. "Thank you for making me feel better." The creature's form rippled, and a sound that might have been laughter floated on the air. It reached out a limb paw, hand, we couldn't quite tell, and gently touched the offerings we had left. Then it looked at us again, and I felt a wave of emotion that wasn't my own, curiosity, caution, and a profound sense of connection. I was born in Belém, a bustling city nestled at the mouth of the Amazon River. My early years were spent in the comforting embrace of my grandparents' home on the outskirts of the city, where the urban sprawl of Belém began to give way to the lush greenery of Ananindeua. Those were simpler times, filled with the aroma of my grandmother's cooking and the rhythmic creaking of my grandfather's rocking chair on the porch. Little did I know that my idyllic childhood was about to be shattered by a series of events that would alter the course of my life forever. It began with the passing of my beloved grandfather. I remember the day vividly, the hushed voices, the black clothes, the suffocating smell of lilies. I was too young to fully comprehend the finality of death, but I understood that a vital presence had been torn from my world. The void left by my grandfather's passing seemed to create a rift in our family's foundation. Within months, my parents' marriage, which I had always perceived as unshakable, began to crumble. Their arguments, once rare and quickly resolved, became frequent and venomous. I would often find myself huddled in my room, hands clasped over my ears, trying to drown out their raised voices. The divorce, when it finally came, was like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Suddenly my world was divided into two separate spheres, my mother's apartment in the city center and my father's new life in a different neighborhood. I felt like a planet knocked out of orbit, oscillating between two suns, never quite finding my place. As if fate hadn't dealt us enough blows, my grandmother's mind began to slip away. It started with small things, forgetting where she had placed her glasses, mixing up the names of her grandchildren. But soon it became clear that this wasn't mere absent-mindedness. The vibrant, loving woman who had been the cornerstone of our family was being consumed by the insidious progression of Alzheimer's disease. Watching her decline was perhaps the most painful experience of all. There were moments of lucidity when she would look at me with recognition, her eyes lighting up with the warmth I remembered. But these moments became increasingly rare, replaced by vacant stares and confused mumbling. The woman who had taught me to read, who had patiently guided my clumsy fingers as I learned to tie my shoelaces, was fading away before my eyes. It was in the wake of these upheavals that my father made the decision to move into a house in the heart of Belém. This house, I would later learn, had been built by my grandmother in the 1970s, during happier times. Little did we know that this seemingly ordinary dwelling would become the stage for a series of extraordinary and terrifying events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. The house on Rua das Mangueiras stood out from its neighbors, not because of any architectural grandeur, but because of the sense of history that seemed to cling to its walls. As we approached it for the first time, I remember feeling a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. The large front yard was overgrown, nature reclaiming what had once been a well-manicured lawn. 2 doors faced the street, one leading to the kitchen, the other to the living room. They seemed to stare at us like eyes, wary of our intrusion. My father unlocked the kitchen door, and we stepped into a time capsule. The air was thick with the musty smell of disuse, mingled with the lingering aroma of decades-old cooking. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimy windows. As my eyes adjusted to the dim interior, I began to make out the details of the space: the outdated appliances, the faded linoleum floor, the worn countertops bearing the scars of countless meal preparations. From the kitchen, a long corridor stretched out before us, disappearing into the shadows of the house's interior. My father flicked a light switch, and a series of bare bulbs flickered to life, illuminating the passage. The corridor formed a T-shape, with bedrooms and a service room branching off to the left, while the right led to another kitchen in the backyard. As we explored the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The room seemed to hold their breath as we entered, only to exhale when we left. In the last bedroom at the end of the left branch of the corridor, I paused. Something about this room felt different. The air was cooler here, and I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper just at the edge of my hearing. When I mentioned this to my father, he laughed it off, attributing it to the old house settling. That night, as I lay in my new bedroom, trying to sleep amidst the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the house, I heard my father moving restlessly in his room across the hall. Little did I know that this was the beginning of his nocturnal torments, experiences he would keep to himself for years to come. In the days that followed, we settled into a routine. My father threw himself into the task of renovating the house, determined to breathe new life into the old structure. I helped where I could, painting walls and clearing out years of accumulated junk from the attic and basement. But even as we worked to make the house our own, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was resistant to our efforts, as if it had a will of its own. It was during this time that I first noticed the shadows. At first I dismissed them as tricks of the light, the natural play of sunlight and shadow in an old house. But as the days wore on, I began to notice patterns. The shadows seemed to move independently of any light source, darting from room to room when viewed from the corner of my eye. When I tried to focus on them directly, they would vanish, leaving me questioning my own perceptions. My father never mentioned seeing anything unusual, but I began to notice changes in his behavior. He became more withdrawn, spending long hours in his study, poring over old books and papers. At night I would often hear him pacing in his room, muttering to himself in low, urgent tones. When I asked him about it, he would brush off my concerns, insisting that he was just having trouble sleeping in the new environment. It wasn't until years later, after my father's passing, that I would discover the truth about those early days in the house on Rua das Mangueiras. His diary, found tucked away in a drawer of his desk, would reveal the full extent of the terror he had experienced and kept hidden from me. The discovery of my father's diary in 2006 was like opening Pandora's box. The leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age and filled with my father's precise handwriting, told a story so terrifying that it shook me to my core. As I read entry after entry, I began to understand the true nature of the house we had lived in and the horrors my father had endured in silence. The first entry was dated just a week after we moved in, July 15, 1995. It happened again last night. The screaming, the banging on my bedroom door. It sounds like a crowd of people angry and desperate. But when I gather the courage to open the door, The hallway is empty and silent. Am I losing my mind? As I read on, the entries became more detailed, more frantic. My father described seeing shadowy figures moving through the T-shaped corridor, always darting from right to left. He wrote about feeling a presence in his room at night, a weight on his chest that made it difficult to breathe. The maids he hired to help with the housework reported similar experiences, refusing to stay in the house after dark. One entry particularly chilled me. September 3rd, 1995. I saw her today. A woman in a white dress standing at the end of the corridor. She was translucent, like a projection on mist. When I called out, she turned to look at me. Her face, God help me, her face was a void, a black emptiness where features should have been. I ran back to my room and locked the door. I can still hear her fingernails scratching at the wood. Reading these accounts, I felt a mix of horror and guilt. How could I have been so oblivious to my father's suffering? Why hadn't he confided in me? The answer, I realized, lay in his final entries. He had been protecting me, shielding me from the terrors that plagued our home. June 10th, 2006. I can't keep this up much longer. The entities in this house are growing stronger, more bold, but I can't leave. I won't leave my child to face this alone. I'll find a way to end this, to cleanse this house. If anything happens to me, I pray that this diary finds its way to my child. Knowledge is power, and in this case it may be the only defense against the darkness that dwells here. This was the last entry in the diary. My father passed away a week later, officially from a heart attack. But now, reading his words, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to his death than natural causes. The diary ended, but our story in the house was far from over. As my mother and I moved in following my father's death, the strange occurrences continued, affecting everyone except me. It was as if I was blind to a world that others could see clearly, and this frustrated me to no end. I yearned for proof, for a glimpse into the supernatural realm that seemed to coexist with our mundane reality. This frustration would lead me down a path of spiritual exploration, delving into various forms of occultism and esoteric practices. Little did I know that my search for answers would only lead to more questions, and that the house on Rua das Mangueiras had many more secrets to reveal. In the years following my father's death, my frustration at being unable to experience the supernatural phenomena that seemed to affect everyone else in the house grew into an obsession. I became determined to pierce the veil between worlds, to see and understand what my father had seen. This determination led me on a journey through various spiritual and occult practices, each promising enlightenment and supernatural power. My first foray was into Gnosticism. The idea of hidden knowledge, of a truth concealed from the masses, appealed to my desire for understanding. I spent months poring over ancient texts, meditating on esoteric symbols, and attempting to achieve gnosis, direct experience of the divine. But despite my efforts, the shadows remained resolutely invisible to me, and the house's mysteries remained unsolved. Undeterred, I turned to voodoo. The raw power of this Afro-Caribbean religion, with its drums and possessions, seemed like it might be the key to unlocking my latent abilities. I attended rituals, learned to create gris-gris bags, and even attempted to communicate with the Loa. But while the ceremonies were fascinating, they brought me no closer to experiencing the phenomena that continued to plague my mother and our household staff. My exploration took a darker turn as I delved into Luciferian rituals. The promise of forbidden knowledge was alluring, and I convinced myself that embracing the darkness might allow me to see the shadows that haunted our home. I performed elaborate ceremonies in the dead of night, calling upon entities I barely understood. Looking back, I shudder at the risks I took during this period. Thankfully, nothing manifested, or if it did, I remained frustratingly blind to it. Realizing that perhaps I was looking in the wrong direction, I turned to more mainstream religions. I studied Islam, drawn by its rich mystical traditions and the concept of jinn, supernatural creatures that seemed similar to what we were experiencing. I learned to recite Quranic verses and performed salat, hoping that this monotheistic faith might offer protection and insight. But the shadows continued their dance, visible to all but me. Hinduism, with its vast pantheon of gods and intricate philosophical systems, was my next stop. I practiced yoga and meditation, chanted mantras, and studied the Vedas. The concept of Maya, the illusory nature of reality, resonated with me, but it didn't help me penetrate the illusion that seemed to hide the supernatural from my perception. Buddhism, with its emphasis on mindfulness and the nature of consciousness, seemed promising. I spent hours in meditation, attempting to cultivate the kind of awareness that might allow me to perceive other realms of existence. But while I found a measure of peace in these practices, the ghosts and shadows remained stubbornly out of my reach. Throughout this spiritual odyssey, life in the house continued its strange rhythm. My mother, grandmother, and the maids would casually mention seeing figures moving from room to room, as if commenting on the weather. They described shadows that seemed to have weight and substance, darting through the T-shaped corridor with unsettling speed. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut without any breeze, and the sensation of being watched was a constant companion. I felt like a blind man in a world of sighted people, desperately seeking a cure for my condition. Each new practice, each new ritual or meditation technique filled me with hope that this, finally, would be the key to unlocking my perception. And each time I was left disappointed and increasingly frustrated. It wasn't until years later, when I had all but given up on my quest, that the supernatural would finally manifest in my experience in an undeniable way. But before that could happen, life had more twists in store for our family, and the house on Rua das Mangueiras had not yet revealed all of its secrets. As my spiritual explorations continued without success, life moved forward relentlessly. In 2012, we received devastating news. My mother was diagnosed with lung cancer. The disease seemed to cast a shadow over our lives, darker and more tangible than any of the spectral entities that haunted our home. Watching my mother battle cancer was a harrowing experience. The strong, vibrant woman who had raised me single-handedly after my father's death was now frail and often bedridden. The treatments were grueling, and there were days when I feared we might lose her. It was during this time that I began to question the purpose of my obsession with the supernatural. In the face of such a real and immediate threat to our family, my quest for ghostly encounters seemed trivial and self-indulgent. Yet even as we grappled with my mother's illness, the strange occurrences in the house continued unabated. If anything, they seemed to intensify, as if feeding off the fear and despair that permeated our home. My mother, in her more lucid moments between treatments, would describe seeing shadowy figures standing at the foot of her bed, watching her. She insisted they weren't threatening, but their presence unsettled her nonetheless. In 2013, in the midst of this turmoil, a ray of hope entered our lives. My daughter was born. Her arrival was like a burst of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time in months, laughter echoed through the old house on Rua das Mangueiras. My mother, despite her weakness, found renewed strength in her role as a grandmother. It was as if my daughter's innocent presence drove back the shadows, if only temporarily. But as my daughter grew, so did my concerns. Would she, like me, be blind to the supernatural forces that seemed to inhabit our home? Or would she, like my mother and the others, be able to see the shadowy figures and experience the strange phenomena? The thought of my child being exposed to these entities filled me with a protective fear I had never known before. By 2015, my mother's condition had deteriorated significantly. The cancer had spread, and the doctors were running out of options. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that my mother made a decision that would change everything. She invited a Mãe de Santo, a priestess from the Afro-Brazilian religion of Candomblé, to perform a cleansing ritual in our backyard. I was skeptical at first. After years of exploring various spiritual practices without results, I had become somewhat cynical about such rituals. But I could see the hope in my mother's eyes, and I didn't have the heart to refuse her this chance, no matter how slim. The Mãe de Santo arrived on a sweltering afternoon in July. She was a striking woman, tall and regal, with eyes that seemed to see right through you. As she set up for the ritual in our backyard, the very spot where most of the shadowy figures had been seen, I felt a palpable tension in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The ritual began with the Maida Santo chanting in Yoruba, her voice rising and falling in hypnotic cadence. She sprinkled sacred herbs and poured libations, calling upon the Orixas, the deities of Candomblé, for protection and healing. As her chants grew more intense, something extraordinary happened. The light bulbs in the back portion of the house began to explode. One by one, they burst with sharp cracks, showering glass and sparks. It wasn't a gentle burning out. Each bulb exploded with a force that sent shards flying across the rooms. The sound was like rapid gunfire echoing through the house. I stood there, frozen in disbelief. This was it, the undeniable proof of the supernatural that I had been seeking for years. And yet, in that moment, I felt no triumph, only a bone-deep terror that left me trembling. The Maida Santo, however, seemed unfazed. If anything, her chants grew louder, more insistent, as if she was locked in a battle of wills with an unseen force. The air crackled with an energy I had never felt before, electric and alive. As suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The last bulb exploded, plunging the back of the house into darkness. In the eerie silence that followed, I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears. The Maida Santo's voice, now soft and soothing, brought me back to reality. "It is done," she said simply, her eyes meeting mine with a knowing look. "The spirits have been appeased." In the days that followed, my mother reported feeling better than she had in months. Whether it was the power of the ritual or simply the hope it had given her, I couldn't say. But I couldn't deny the change in her. She seemed more energetic, more alive. As for me, the experience had left me shaken to my core. After years of seeking proof of the supernatural, I had finally received it in the most dramatic way possible. But instead of satisfaction, I felt a deep, unsettling fear. What exactly were we dealing with in this house? And what had we unleashed with this ritual? Little did I know this was just the beginning. The events that followed would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality, faith, and the thin veil that separates our world from the unseen realms beyond. In the months following the Candomblé ritual, I found myself in a state of constant unease. The exploding light bulbs had shattered more than just glass. They had broken through the walls of skepticism I had built around myself. I could no longer deny the reality of the supernatural forces at work in our home. This realization led me to many sleepless nights, tossing and turning as I replayed the events in my mind. It was during one of these restless nights that I had a dream so vivid and profound that it would alter the course of my life once again. In the dream, I found myself standing in the T-shaped corridor of our house. The air was thick with a luminous mist that seemed to pulse with life. At the end of the corridor stood a figure bathed in golden light. As I approached, I realized it was the Virgin Mary, her eyes filled with infinite compassion. She spoke to me, her voice resonating not in my ears, but in my very soul. "My child," she said, "you have been seeking with your eyes open. Now learn to see with your heart." I woke up with tears streaming down my face, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The dream felt more real than any of my waking experiences with the supernatural. It was as if a veil had been lifted, allowing me to see clearly for the first time. Driven by this experience, I found myself drawn back to the Catholic faith of my childhood. The very next Sunday, I attended Mass for the first time in years. As I sat in the pew, listening to the familiar rhythms of the liturgy, I felt a profound sense of homecoming. However, my return to Catholicism seemed to trigger a new wave of supernatural activity in the house. It was as if the entities that had been lurking in the shadows were now boldly making their presence known. The first incident occurred just days after my first Mass. I was walking down the T-shaped corridor when I saw it, a gray amorphous mass darting from the backyard towards the last bedroom. It moved with startling speed, but what struck me most was the sense of intelligence behind its movement. This wasn't some mindless specter. It felt like a conscious entity, observing and reacting to my presence. Weeks later, on a quiet afternoon, I had an encounter that chilled me to the bone. I was passing by one of the bedrooms when I caught a glimpse of movement. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, ran from one room to another. She had bright blonde hair, fair skin, and wore a white lace dress that seemed to belong to another era. My heart racing, I followed her into the bedroom, calling out softly. But when I entered the room, it was empty. There was no sign of the child, no place she could have hidden. The window was closed and latched from the inside. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air. These experiences, as terrifying as they were, also filled me with a strange sense of validation. After years of being the only one unable to see the supernatural activity in the house, I was now experiencing it firsthand. But with this validation came a growing fear. What were these entities? What did they want? And more importantly, were they a threat to my family? My spiritual journey wasn't over yet. As I delved deeper into my renewed faith, I felt drawn to the rich traditions and mysticism of Eastern Orthodoxy. The icons, the incense, the sense of ancient wisdom, all of it spoke to something deep within me. After months of study and contemplation, I made the decision to convert to Orthodox Christianity. Little did I know that this decision would mark the beginning of the most intense and terrifying period of supernatural activity our house had ever seen. The entities that haunted our home seemed to react to my newfound faith with a fury that would test the limits of my sanity and my belief. As I embraced my new spiritual path, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched more closely than ever before. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, the whispers in the night more insistent. It was as if my declaration of faith had drawn a line in the sand, and the entities on the other side were preparing for battle. I was about to learn that in the realm of the supernatural, faith can be both a powerful shield and a provocative challenge. The events that followed would push me to the very edge of my beliefs and force me to confront the darkness that had taken root in our home. My conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy seemed to act as a catalyst, intensifying the supernatural activity in our house to unprecedented levels. It was as if my embrace of this ancient faith had stirred up a hornet's nest of spiritual entities, each more determined than the last to make their presence known. The first major incident occurred on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. My daughter, now a toddler, was playing in the very bedroom where I had seen the phantom girl in the white lace dress. I was in the kitchen preparing a snack for her when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, the slam of a heavy door, followed by my daughter's terrified screams. I ran towards her room, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the door, I found it shut tight. I turned the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside. "Sweetie, can you open the door?" I called out, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. But my daughter's only response was continued screaming and crying. A primal fear took over me. I threw my body against the door once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th attempt, I felt something give way. The door burst open, nearly coming off its hinges. My daughter was huddled in the corner of the room, her eyes wide with terror. I scooped her up in my arms, murmuring soothing words as I checked her for any injuries. Physically, she was unharmed, but the fear in her eyes told me that the damage went deeper than any physical wound. As I calmed her down, I surveyed the room. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet the atmosphere felt charged, as if the air itself was crackling with an unseen energy. The door, which I knew for a fact didn't have a lock, now sported a heavy antique latch that I had never seen before. As I watched, the latch seemed to shimmer and then fade away, leaving the door as it had always been. This incident shook me to my core. It was one thing for these entities to target me, but threatening my child crossed a line. I knew I had to take action to protect my family. Drawing on my newfound Orthodox faith, I decided to create a spiritual barrier in our home. I hung religious icons in the T-shaped corridor, focusing on powerful protectors like Saint Michael the Archangel and Saint George the Dragon Slayer. I blessed each room with holy water and recited prayers of protection. To my relief, these measures seemed to have an effect. The oppressive atmosphere in the house lifted somewhat, and the more dramatic manifestations ceased. But the entities were far from gone. Instead, they seemed to retreat into the shadows, their presence becoming more subtle but no less unsettling. For years we lived in a state of uneasy coexistence with the unseen inhabitants of our home. We would hear knocks on bedroom doors when no one was there, loud bangs that echoed through the house in the dead of night, and footsteps in empty rooms. The shadows continued their dance at the edges of our vision, always just out of clear sight. Some of the occurrences were almost comical in their absurdity. On multiple occasions we would hear the toilet seat in the bathroom lifting and lowering on its own, as if some unseen entity was using the facilities. It was tempting to laugh off these incidents, to try and find rational explanations. But we knew better. The house had shown us too much of its true nature for us to doubt anymore. Even my daughter, as she grew older, began to have her own encounters. One night, when she was about 5 years old, she woke up needing to use the bathroom. As she sat on the toilet, still groggy with sleep, she saw something that would haunt her dreams for years to come. A tall, lanky gray figure stood in the doorway watching her. Its face was featureless except for a wide, sharp-toothed grin that seemed to split its head in half. As my daughter stared in horror, unable to move or cry out, the figure raised a long-fingered hand as if in greeting. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. When she told me about this encounter the next morning, I was torn between wanting to dismiss it as a nightmare and the chilling certainty that what she had seen was all too real. The description matched too closely with other sightings in the house to be mere coincidence. As the years passed, we learned to live with the constant undercurrent of supernatural activity. It became a part of our daily lives, as routine as the creaking of old floorboards or the whistle of wind through loose window panes. But we never let our guard down completely. We knew that at any moment, the tenuous peace could be shattered, and the entities could once again assert their presence in more dramatic and terrifying ways. Little did we know that the most chilling encounter was yet to come, an event that would force us to confront the true nature of the forces we were dealing with, and question everything we thought we knew about the barriers between our world and the realms beyond. It was a balmy evening in Belém, the kind where the air hangs heavy with humidity and the scent of blooming jasmine. My daughter was at a sleepover, leaving the house unusually quiet. My wife and I were in our bedroom, enjoying a rare moment of peace as we chatted about the events of the day. Our conversation drifted to a young woman we knew, recently married and expecting her first child. We spoke of her excitement, her hopes and fears about impending motherhood. It was a normal, mundane conversation, the kind that happens in countless homes every night. But what happened next was far from normal. As we talked, a voice suddenly cut through our conversation. Clear and distinct, it said, "You quero a minha mãe." I want my mama, in English. The voice seemed to come from within our very walls, as if the house itself was speaking. We froze, our own conversation dying mid-sentence. The voice was unsettling, not just in its sudden appearance, but in its quality. It sounded like an adult trying to mimic a child's voice, a grotesque parody of innocence that sent chills down my spine. For a moment we sat in stunned silence, looking at each other with wide eyes. Then, almost against my will, I felt a surge of anger rise within me. After years of enduring these supernatural intrusions, this felt like a violation of our most intimate spaces. "Shut up," I shouted at the unseen entity. "I hate you. You'll lose anyway." As soon as the words left my mouth, I felt a shift in the atmosphere of the room. The air seemed to grow colder, and the shadows in the corners deepened. It was as if my outburst had provoked a response from whatever forces inhabited our home. Determined to find a rational explanation, I went outside to check with our neighbors. But they were all gathered in their front yard, a good 30 meters away from where we had heard the voice. There was no way their conversation could have carried so clearly into our bedroom. As I returned to the house, a chilling realization settled over me. This was no trick of acoustics, no overheard snippet of conversation. The voice we had heard was something else entirely, something that defied rational explanation. This incident marked a turning point in our relationship with the supernatural forces in our home. It was as if a line had been crossed, a boundary violated. The entities were no longer content with shadows and movement. They had found a voice, and they were using it to communicate directly with us. In the days and weeks that followed, we were on high alert, constantly listening for any further vocal manifestations. But the house remained stubbornly silent, as if the entities were waiting, biding their time for their next move. This experience forced me to confront my beliefs about the nature of these supernatural occurrences. As an Orthodox Christian, I didn't believe in ghosts in the conventional sense. Our faith teaches that after death, souls go either to heaven or to hell, not lingering in earthly realms. But if not ghosts, then what were we dealing with? The more I pondered this question, the more I began to suspect that we were facing something far more sinister and complex than mere spectral remnants of the deceased. I began to see our supernatural roommates not as lost souls, but as demons, entities that thrive on deception and fear. This realization was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Terrifying because it meant we were up against forces of genuine evil. Comforting because my faith gave me tools to combat such entities. I doubled down on my spiritual practices, praying more fervently than ever before. I sought guidance from my priest, who listened to my story with a grave expression before offering prayers of protection and advice on strengthening our spiritual defenses. But even as I fortified our home spiritually, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were engaged in a battle that was far from over. The voice in the walls had opened a new chapter in our haunted saga, one that would challenge our sanity, our faith, and our very understanding of reality. As I write this memoir, sitting in the very house where all these events transpired, I can't help but wonder what the future holds. Will we ever be free of these supernatural presences? Or are we destined to continue this uneasy coexistence, always waiting for the next manifestation, the next intrusion from the world beyond? One thing is certain, our experiences in this house have forever changed us. We've glimpsed a reality beyond the veil of the everyday world, a reality that most people never encounter. It's a heavy knowledge to carry, but also a profound one. To those who might read this and doubt, I can only say this: there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Our story is true, every chilling, inexplicable bit of it. And if it serves as a warning, a call to open your eyes to the unseen realities that surround us all, then perhaps all our fear and struggle will have served a purpose. As for me and my family, we continue to live in this house, navigating the thin line between the natural and supernatural worlds. We've learned to coexist with the unknown, to find strength in our faith and in each other, and we remain ever vigilant, knowing that at any moment the veil between worlds might once again grow thin, bringing us face to face with the mysteries that lurk in the shadows of our home on Rua das Mangueiras. Stay safe, dear listener, and remember, not all houses are merely brick and mortar. Some, like ours, are gateways to realms beyond our understanding. May you never find yourself on the wrong side of that gateway. The crisp autumn air bit at my skin as I stepped out onto the porch, my eyes scanning the darkening sky. It was a chilly evening in 1982, and the wind whispered through the trees surrounding our rural home. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me ever since my father had shared a story from his past, a tale that had haunted him for years. I was in my early 20s then, having recently moved back home after a stint in the city. The transition from urban life to our quiet wooded property had been jarring, but there was something comforting about being back where I grew up. As I stood there lost in thought, my father joined me on the porch, his weathered hands clutching a steaming mug of coffee. "Thinking about that story again?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. I nodded, turning to face him. In the fading light, I could see the lines etched deep into his face, each one a testament to the years of hard work and worry he'd endured. But there was something else there, too, a shadow that crossed his features whenever he spoke of that night. "Tell me again," I urged, even though I knew every detail by heart. Something about hearing it from him made it feel more real, more immediate. He sighed, taking a long sip of his coffee before setting the mug down on the porch railing. "It was a night much like this one," he began, his eyes growing distant as he cast his mind back. "Your aunt had come down from Toronto to visit. She left around 9 p.m., but her car broke down about 7 miles from here." I listened intently, even though I knew what was coming. The way he told it, I could almost see it happening. My aunt's car sputtering to a stop in front of a family friend's house, the relief on her face when they offered to let her use their phone. "I drove down to pick her up," my father continued. "She decided to stay the night with us and deal with the car in the morning. It was after 10 p.m. by the time we started heading back home." He paused then, his hands gripping the porch railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. I waited, knowing he was steeling himself for what came next. "We were driving through that stretch of woods, you know, the one about halfway between here and town, when we heard it. A scream like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It was inhuman, loud enough to drown out the radio, the engine, everything. I shivered, not entirely from the cold. I'd driven that road countless times, but ever since hearing this story, it had taken on a sinister quality in my mind. I slammed on the brakes," my father went on, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Your aunt and I were both freaking out, trying to figure out what the hell we'd just heard. And then we saw it." He fell silent for a long moment, his eyes focused on something far away. I waited, holding my breath. It was at the edge of the headlights, just off to the side of the road. At first I thought it was a coyote, but it was standing on its hind legs, and it was huge, at least 7 feet tall. Its tail, I'll never forget that tail, black and white stripes like something out of a nightmare. I'd heard this description many times, but it never failed to send a chill down my spine. The image it conjured was too bizarre, too wrong to be real, and yet the fear in my father's eyes was all too genuine. "It walked across the road in front of the car," he continued. "Just calmly walked across on 2 legs, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and then it disappeared into the woods on the other side. That's when we heard the scream again, even louder this time, like it was right next to the car. We got out of there as fast as we could." As he finished his story, we both fell into a contemplative silence. The darkness had fully settled in now, the woods around our house, a black void, punctuated only by the faint glow of our porch light. "You really think it was a skinwalker?" I asked, voicing the question that had been on my mind ever since I first heard the tale. My father shrugged, picking up his now cold coffee. "I don't know what it was. All I know is what I saw and what I heard, and I hope to God I never see or hear anything like it again." With that, he turned and went back into the house, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the endless darkness of the forest. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. I'd grown up hearing stories of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches from Navajo legend, but I'd always dismissed them as just that, stories. Now, faced with my father's unwavering belief in what he'd seen, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I found myself growing increasingly obsessed with my father's encounter. I scoured the internet for similar stories, pored over books on cryptozoology and Native American folklore, and even reached out to local historians to see if they had heard of any similar incidents in the area. My search yielded little concrete information, but it did uncover a pattern of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena in the region stretching back decades. There were reports of unusually large bipedal animals, eerie screams in the night, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to permeate certain areas of the forest. One afternoon, while helping my father clear some brush from the edge of our property, I decided to broach the subject again. "Dad," I began hesitantly, "have you ever thought about going back to that spot, where you saw it?" He paused in his work, leaning on his rake as he considered my question. "Why would I want to do that?" he asked, his tone guarded. I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "I don't know. Closure, maybe? Or to see if there's any evidence of something unusual in the area?" My father's expression darkened. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and serious. "There are some things in this world that we're not meant to understand. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't natural, and it's best left alone." His words should have discouraged me, but they only fueled my curiosity. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I grabbed a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook, and slipped out of the house. The night was cool and clear, a full moon casting an eerie glow over the landscape. As I drove towards the spot where my father had his encounter, my heart pounded in my chest, a mix of excitement and fear coursing through my veins. The stretch of road where it happened was unremarkable in the daylight, just another wooded section of highway. But at night it took on a different character. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. Every shadow held the potential for something other. I parked my car on the shoulder and stepped out, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. For hours I wandered the area, searching for, I wasn't even sure what. Unusual tracks, tufts of fur, anything that might corroborate my father's story. But the forest kept its secrets close. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I reluctantly headed back to my car. I was tired, cold, and no closer to answers than when I'd started. But as I reached for the door handle, a sound froze me in place. A scream, distant but unmistakable. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite animal, not quite human, but something in between. The sound seemed to go on forever, rising and falling in pitch until it suddenly cut off. I stood there, my heart racing, straining my ears for any further noise, but there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the forest. With shaking hands, I got into my car and drove home, my mind reeling. I had heard it, the same sound my father had described. It was real. From that night on, my obsession grew. I began spending more and more time in the woods, always under the guise of hiking or nature photography. I set up trail cameras, collected soil samples, and interviewed locals about any strange experiences they might have had. My parents grew concerned about my newfound fascination with the forest. They couldn't understand why I was suddenly spending so much time outdoors, often returning home late at night, muddy and exhausted. "You need to be careful out there," my mother warned one evening as I was preparing to head out again. "The woods can be dangerous, especially at night." If only she knew the half of it. As the months passed, I began to notice subtle changes in the forest. Areas that had once been teeming with wildlife now stood eerily silent. I found strange markings on trees, deep gouges that couldn't have been made by any normal animal. And always there was that feeling of being watched, of something just beyond the edge of my vision. It was on a crisp autumn evening, almost exactly a year after my first nighttime excursion, that everything changed. I was deep in the woods, farther than I'd ever ventured before. The sun had set hours ago, and I was relying on my flashlight and the faint glow of the moon to navigate. As I picked my way through a particularly dense patch of underbrush, my foot caught on something, sending me sprawling to the ground. Cursing under my breath, I turned to see what had tripped me. What I saw made my blood run cold. Half buried in the leaf litter was a bone, a large bone, too large to belong to any animal native to these woods. With trembling hands, I brushed away the leaves, revealing more bones, a rib cage, a pelvis, a skull. The skull was the most disturbing part. It was clearly animal in origin, but wrong somehow. The eye sockets were too large, the jaw too elongated, and the teeth, row upon row of sharp, serrated teeth, more like a shark's than any land animal I'd ever seen. As I crouched there, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a twig snapped behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, at the edge of the light, stood a figure. For a moment my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was tall, easily 7 feet or more, and covered in a patchwork of fur and what looked like scales? Its legs were bent backward like a dog's hind legs, ending in massive clawed feet. But it was the face that truly horrified me. It was a twisted amalgamation of coyote and human features. The snout was elongated, filled with teeth that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. But the eyes were disturbingly human, filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Then slowly, deliberately, its mouth opened. What came out was the same scream I had heard a year ago, that unearthly howl that was neither human nor animal. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction or safety. Behind me I could hear it giving chase, its footfalls shaking the very ground. I don't know how long I ran, or how I found my way back to my car. All I know is that somehow I made it. As I sped away, my headlights caught a glimpse of something standing at the edge of the road, a tall, impossible figure that seemed to shimmer and shift in the darkness. When I finally made it home, I was a mess, covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes torn and muddy. My parents were frantic, demanding to know what had happened. But how could I explain? How could I tell them that the monster from Dad's story was real, and that I had seen it with my own eyes? In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a product of too many sleepless nights and an overactive imagination. But deep down I knew the truth. What I had seen was real as the bone-chilling scream that now haunted my dreams. I never went back into those woods, but sometimes on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that scream again, drifting on the breeze, a reminder that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. As the years passed, I tried to put that night behind me. I moved away, started a family, built a life far from those dark woods. But the memory never faded. It lingered, always there in the back of my mind, coloring how I saw the world. I became a writer, channeling my experiences into fiction stories of the unknown and the unexplainable. My readers praised my vivid imagination, never knowing that my most terrifying tales were rooted in truth. It wasn't until my own child was born that I truly understood my father's reluctance to speak about what he'd seen. As I held my newborn, I realized that there are some truths too heavy, too dangerous to pass on, some mysteries that are better left unsolved. But still, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking back to those woods, to the creature I saw, to the scream that still echoes in my nightmares. And I wonder, what else is out there lurking in the shadows just beyond the edge of what we know? I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Not my wife, not my friends, not even my own child. But sometimes when I look into the darkness at the edge of our property, I catch myself listening, waiting. For what, I'm not sure. Maybe one day when my child is older, I'll find the courage to share my story, to pass on the knowledge that the world is stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. But for now, I keep my secret, and I watch the shadows, always aware that something might be watching back. And so, life goes on. I wake each morning, go about my day, and try to forget. But in the quiet moments, when the world grows still and the shadows deepen, I remember. I remember the creature in the woods, the impossible skull half buried in the leaves, and the scream that shattered the night. I remember, and I wonder, what if it remembers me too?